This is Marla. Welcome back to my channel for another Christmas in July YouTube video tutorial. Today we're creating a non-traditional Christmas card featuring some products from Pink Fresh Studio. Some of them are not available anymore, but I will link some products that are similar in the description box below. I'll be using Brutus Monroe's Alabaster White embossing powder and Magnolia pattern from Pink Fresh Studio. This is a large 6x6 red rubber stamp. I'm going to be doing some watercoloring today with some Catherine Pooler inks. So I prepped my Canson XL watercolor paper, which has been cut to 6x6 with my anti-static tool. I'm using my Versamark ink to ink up my stamp. This is a clear watermark ink, and I am going to add the embossing powder on top. I do use a little stamping tool, which in most cases will help me get a good impression. It's really hard to see when you're going white on white with embossing powder. So there was an area on the left-hand side of the stamp that I didn't get, but the reason that I chose to go with a 6x6 piece of cardstock was so that I could choose an area that I liked. If there was an area that I wasn't quite certain about, if that I liked, I could certainly move the frame over or the die over and cut a different area. So it just gave me a little bit more possibilities. I do have a watercolor brush. I started with just spritzing some water onto my glass mat, and then I added that lime Rickey ink to the glass mat as well. I made sure that my brush had water on it. I didn't want it soaking wet. In fact, you're going to be able to see a difference. There is a time in this video where I do have too much water on my brush, and I'll show you how I was able to fix the areas that I didn't like. But for now, I've started with just a very damp brush, and then I add it to that lime Rickey ink. I'm using the stamp as a template, and what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to find all of the leaves. So by using the stamp, the back of the stamp, the image that's printed on the back, it really does help me map out what I want to color. And doing the leaves first, because they do have a very unique impression on them, there are several lines, it was much easier to find those. So that was the area that I chose to start with. Once I got the majority of them down, I'm going to move on to some of the magnolias. For this card, I was inspired by the Color Throwdown Challenge this week. The colors were pink, aqua, lime, and yellow. And so for my pink, I'm using Catherine Pooler's Be Mine, using the same technique. Now, for the flowers, because they are a larger area, what I'd like to do is lay down a wash of color, and which is what I'm doing here. I'll go through the magnolias that I want to color pink, lay down that wash of color. I'll let them dry, and then once they're dry, I'll come back in and I'll start adding shadows. For the flowers, I'm going to add shadows at the bottom and then in between the petals very subtly. As you work with watercolors, you begin to understand that it's all about the layering. You don't want to try to get all of your color down in one pass. So if you can be a little bit light-handed and let them dry, it takes a little bit more patience, you are going to get a much better, a much smoother application. When I move over to the aqua, which is going to be Catherine Pooler's Aquatini, I actually had a very thirsty brush, so I had a lot of water in that brush. These brushes are they're called Wonder brushes, I believe. I'll link them in the description box. They hold a lot of water, and so you'll see eventually I will end up bringing in a microfiber cloth. I'll bring in a cup of water and I'll start dipping my brush into the cup of water, and that's when it starts getting to be a little bit have a little bit too much water. But right here, all I'm doing is using that Be Mine and laying down the color. As I go through the flowers, I see more of the leaves that I missed, and so I clean off my brush, use that lime Rickey to add some more of that green. Later on, I will go back into those leaves and I will add a second application to them, adding a little bit of depth. But because they're so much smaller than the flowers, the additional color that I add doesn't stand out as much as it will for the flowers. So here is the Aquatini. Now this Magnolia stamp does have several magnolias on it, but I thought that this would be a beautiful background for a Christmas card. And I love, I've talked about this before, where I love non-traditional colors for my Christmas cards. I will do some later on that are more traditional, but I do like to go with a non-traditional look. I like the idea of using some of my floral stamps to create backgrounds that will allow me to add a Christmas sentiment. So back to the card real quick, you can see how much shinier the paper is, and that's because I have much more water on my brush than I did when I was using the pink. I am going to step that back a little bit. You can see that I did bring in that cup of water. There's my microfiber cloth. So as I dip the brush into the water, I will bring it to the microfiber cloth. I'm laying down a wash of color again. You can add water to the bottom of your flower and then kind of draw it up. But because I did the heat embossing and because I don't see the lines quite as well, it's much easier for me just to add that full wash of color instead of trying to thin it out and then coming back in as I usually would with more layers that are a little bit darker and that define the shadows a little bit more. I'm going to go back and start adding the second layer of pink to some of those flowers, and you'll see how different that they start to look. They become much more prominent. For the Aquatini, I am going to work a little bit more on those flowers because I did get some harsh water lines as a result of having too much water on my brush initially. So I am going to have to work through that. One of the recommendations that I would have when you are doing watercoloring is, instead of taking your brush back to more ink when you have harsh lines, I typically will add clear water to my brush and then I'll tap it onto my microfiber cloth, getting some of that excess water off, and then I draw my brush from the top of my image down, and that will smooth out some of those harsh lines that I have. You want to be really careful, especially when you're using inexpensive paper such as I am with this Canson XL, that you don't overwork the paper. So you really don't want too much water on it, because then your images will start to buckle, and you will also get those really harsh lines that just aren't very attractive. There's a time when you're dropping in color that those water lines are something that you're looking for, but what I'm doing here, I don't want those harsh water lines, and I'm not I want more of a smooth look. So I'll just continue working at this, adding some of the depth with the Aquatini and the Be Mine, and then I'll go back, and I don't think I do it on camera as much, but I will add a little bit more to the leaves to try to get those a little bit darker. There are vines, and I will use the brush as I find them to start adding the vines in. There were a couple that actually didn't emboss, so I just kind of looked at the image on that stamp and I just drew them in. And I think we are getting really close to ending the watercoloring. For the center of the flowers, I'm using Tiara, which is a yellow from Catherine Pooler. As I mentioned, the colors for the color throwdown were yellow, green, aqua, and pink, and so I wanted to add that little bit of yellow, and I added it to the centers of the flowers. There are some that kind of look like a cone flower. The illustration basically is the flower just hasn't opened up all the way, and so the center of the flower is just a little bit more prominent. As I mentioned, this Magnolia pattern stamp set is available, and I will link it in the description box below. The other products that I used from Pink Fresh Studio were not available, unfortunately. They must retire their stuff fairly quickly, so I have a stamp set that is going to say Merry and Bright, and it's from the Merry and Bright frames, so if you happen to have that, you can certainly use that, but there are lots of small or large images that say Merry Christmas, etc., that you can use with a background like this. I also used a very thin die that came from their So Pretty die set, and I stacked it twice to make sure that I had because it's so thin, I wanted to make sure that I really had a nice piece of chipboard. I just cut it one more time because sometimes when you're using those very thin rectangles, you can glue them down and they don't maintain their shape, and so that's why I went ahead and just doubled that up. I'm stamping with the stamp from the Merry and Bright frames. I'm using that Aquatini ink. Obviously I'm using the sentiment that says Merry and Bright. I'm going to stamp this 3 times. The first time that I stamped it, I die cut it first, and then I tried to stamp over it and I just completely messed it up. So I went with the stamping first, and then I'll use the die to cut it out. I'll use the best image on top and glue all 3 layers together, again giving that nice chipboard feel. For the Magnolia, I am going to use the Lawn Fawn stitched rectangle to die cut that image, and since I used a 6x6 stamp and I used the larger piece of paper, it's going to give me more options as to which areas that I like the best, and I'll just die cut that out and we will use that for our card. Our finished card is going to be 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I love top folding card bases, so that is what I use on my cards. And now we can start putting everything together. So here's that stitched rectangle. I'm kind of looking which areas I like. There were some areas that were a little bit more muted where the embossing powder didn't quite stick where it needed to. So this was the perfect area from that watercoloring that we did. I'll use my liquid glue to adhere it down. And then I'll use that smaller frame. There are lots of these smaller frames that are available. Simon Says Stamp has a couple. I'm sure that Pink Fresh Studio probably has released more of these. I just love these delicate frames. I think that they just add a little something to a card. And once I get the frame down, I'll add the Merry and Bright, and then I'll use my white Pink Fresh Studio jewels. And I'm actually going to add more than I usually do. The last couple of times that I've used these jewels, I've used them a little bit more heavy-handed, but I like the sparkle on the card. I love the look of this non-traditional card using a floral background. Let me know in the comments section if this is something that you like to do, or maybe it's inspired you to look at some of your regular floral stamps and use them for a Christmas card. If so, I would love to know. Once I finish gluing all of these down, I'll give you a close-up look of the card, and that will complete my Christmas card for today. So I want to thank you so much for joining me. If you like the video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. It gets me out into the YouTube community a little bit more. And until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks for watching.